The First World War, for all of its horrors, was a time of enormous technological progress. We'll talk in our regular episodes about the development in flight, submarines, motorized vehicles, soy sausages, the zipper, and so forth. But perhaps nowhere did advances come as quickly and as often as in the field of medicine. In fact, medicine advanced more in the 4 years of this war than in any other 4-year period in history, either before or since. I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about medical treatment during the First World War. Yes, medical treatment. We'll cover other aspects of medicine in other specials since it's a very large topic. When the war began, the world leaders in medicine were France, Germany, Britain, and Austria-Hungary. Russia did have fine doctors, but not so many when compared to its enormous population. Army's medical corps were called on to treat wounds, disease, poison gas victims, flamethrower victims, shell shock, and also to improve sanitary conditions in the trenches. The work was extremely difficult, often dangerous, and had a myriad of challenges according to each battlefront. The initial challenge was to bring a wounded man away from the fighting to a medical facility, since the sooner you received medical attention, the more likely you were to survive. Many wounds were also contaminated and infected by the filth and the mud of life on the front or in the trenches. The Western Front, because of the stalemate, allowed the medical corps to have well-organized, structured systems running from the front lines back to base, and even specialized hospitals far from the front or back home in Britain, France, or Germany. Wounded soldiers would be carried by stretcher bearers, often themselves under fire, to a first aid station where wounds could be temporarily treated to allow further transport to more sophisticated and better equipped facilities. The British Army Medical Corps, as an example, had an evacuation plan as follows. Stretcher bearers brought the wounded to a regimental aid post, then an advanced dressing station, where the particular case would begin to be documented, and then they'd be transported to a casualty clearing station, which was a large unit with 7 medical officers and a substantial staff to help the doctors. If they were expecting combat, then surgical teams would join these stations. They were about 20 kilometers from the front and usually treated a minimum of 200 soldiers, though this number could exceed 1,000 during heavy fighting. This was really the first place the soldier entered that was like a full-service hospital, with actual operating tents and rooms, and the first place he'd see a nurse. It might well also be the last, as evidenced by the large military cemeteries located near casualty clearing stations. A side note here, the British had used X-ray machines in the Boer Wars, so they had them pretty much from the beginning of this war. Badly wounded soldiers might remain at the stations for a few weeks and then be sent to general, stationary, or base area hospitals, specialized hospitals for victims of gas, venereal disease, shell shock, or epidemics. They might also be sent to a hospital back home. In the German army, wounded soldiers wore 2 information tags, one to show what injury was diagnosed and the other to show what treatment had already been given. As you may imagine, whatever the soldier's nationality, if he had superficial wounds, he may well be glad to enter the chain of evacuation to have a break from the front until it was determined that he needed no further treatment and was sent back up. Russia was faced with different problems. For example, they trained thousands of new nurses, but had a tough time transporting them to where they were needed. Interestingly, the Tsarina and her daughters became nurses, and as you may imagine, nurses with titles were able to get postings far from the gruesome realities of the front. When the war broke out, the first wounded Russians were just put on trains and sent to Petrograd, where they were left at the station because no plans had been made to receive them. Now, the Eastern Front was not static like in the West, and so you couldn't really build semi-permanent medical facilities, and the fluctuations in the Eastern Front kind of assured that soldiers quickly getting good medical treatment would be few and far between. By 1917, wounded Russian soldiers loaded onto trains might wait 4 or 5 days for basic medical care. The death of doctors prompted foreign medicals to join the Russian Medical Corps. American surgeon Dr. Malcolm Grove volunteered and was eventually awarded the Cross of St. George by the Tsar personally, and would later become the first Surgeon General of the United States Air Force and a Major General. As I said, different fronts presented different problems, and one really front-specific problem was malaria on the Salonika front. Up to 40% of the British and French soldiers there were disabled by malaria, and it killed more troops there than combat did. People referred to the Salonika Expeditionary Force as one giant infirmary. During the course of the war, over 1.5 million troops in total were infected with malaria. But that was just a fraction of the millions upon millions of sick and wounded soldiers the war produced. Mud, filth, feces, rotting corpses, stagnant water, rats, and tightly packed men in trenches produced some of the worst sanitary conditions possible. When food was scarce, things got even worse as soldiers became more susceptible to disease. Illnesses and epidemics were sometimes more deadly than the war itself. The Spanish flu, which we'll cover in detail later on, took about as many American soldiers as combat did, and they were being ravaged by it even while still training at home in the States. But as a result of the enormous number and variety of wounds and illnesses, medicine made great leaps and bounds. Cellucotton, blood transfusions, and blood banks were big advances that grew out of the war. Motorized ambulances transported the wounded at a faster rate, and mobile X-ray machines could scan the wounded immediately. Plastic surgery was invented for the hundreds of thousands of disfigured men whose faces were too terrifying for them to lead normal lives. Morphine had been around for decades, but it was used extensively and effectively as a painkiller, and sphagnum moss turned out to be an excellent dressing for war wounds. It's light, has antiseptic properties, absorbs many times its own weight in fluids, and grows throughout Britain. Another thing that was discovered was the sterile properties of maggots. Yes, you heard that right. A badly wounded soldier stuck in no man's land for 2 days was finally brought in. The wounds he had were typically fatal because of infection, but the doctor attending him saw that the wounds were clean. There was new pink growth and no infection. The wound was, though, covered in maggots. That doctor was a professor of surgery at Johns Hopkins Medical School, and he publicized his findings. Research found that the maggots had medicinal properties. They ate only dead tissue, so they in fact cleaned the wounds, crawled into tiny recesses where topical antiseptics could not be applied. They gave off urea, which itself is an antiseptic that destroys Staphylococcus and other bacteria, and they promoted the growth of healthy tissue. Penicillin was not invented yet, and until it became widespread, maggots were cutting-edge medical treatment. They've even made a comeback today for use with certain skin ulcers. The advances in medical treatment and medical technology changed the nature of war and the wounded. When the war began, if you were badly wounded, you very probably died. But by 1918, you very probably lived. That is an enormous difference. Even because of just one advance, the Thomas splint, you could see a huge difference. In 1914, 80% of soldiers with broken femurs died, but because of the splint, by 1916, 80% of soldiers with broken femurs lived. But the advances in the organization of medicine and the chain of treatment, particularly caused by the stalemate of the Western Front, were reflected first at home in Britain, France, and Germany, and then in the rest of the world, with chains of organization eventually creating the modern medical system of hospitals, clinics, and ambulances that we rely on today, rather than simply a local general practitioner or a cottage hospital run by a charity. And that is perhaps the biggest advance of them all. Thanks to John Dewar Gleisner for helping out with the research for this special episode. If you want to learn more about the life in the trenches and the conditions there, you can click right here for one of our very first ever special episodes. See you next time.